Well, I declare open this hearing of the Senate Environment and Communications References Committee inquiry into oil and gas exploration and production in the Beetaloo Basin. I begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet and pay our respects to the elders past and present. On behalf of the committee, I welcome you all here today. The committee will be conducting its hearing in person and via video conference. Thank you in advance for your patience with any of the technical issues that we encounter along the way. For the benefit of all participants, I'm the chair of this committee, Senator Sarah Hanson-Young, and I'm joined today via video conference or teleconference by Senators Bragg, the Deputy Chair, McMahon, McCarthy, Senator Sheldon, and I believe Senator Thorpe will join us later. This is a public hearing and a Hansard transcript of the proceedings is being made. The hearing is also being broadcast via the Australian Parliament House website. Before the committee starts taking evidence, I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It is unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as contempt. It is also contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. The committee generally prefers evidence to be given in public, but under the Senate's resolutions, witnesses have the right to be heard in private session. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the ground upon which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer, having regard to the ground on which it is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request the answer be given in camera. Such a request may, of course, be made at any other time. Those participating via video conference and teleconference are reminded to please state their name before speaking to assist the Hansard staff, and also mute your devices when you do not have the call. Finally, please note that the return date for answers to questions on notice will be the 4th of April 2022, so not too far away. I now welcome representatives from Origin Energy and Santos. We were hoping that there would be representatives from Tamboran Resources Limited, another company that is involved in exploration in the Beetaloo Basin, but despite being asked to attend, they have not bothered to show up, and I might have some things to say about that later. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you both. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full names and the capacities in which you appear today? We might start with you, Mr. O'Grady, and then we'll move on. I'll invite you both to make a short opening statement, but let's get your names on the records first.
Tim O'Grady, General Manager, Government Engagement for Origin Energy.
Thank you.
Tracy Winters, currently acting as EVP, Environment, Sustainability and Governance.
Thank you. Mr. O'Grady, would you like to, have you got an opening statement for us you'd like to give? Oh, sorry, you've got two other Origin staff here on the line. Yep. If they would like to introduce themselves, Mr. Cole and Mr. Nish.
Hello, everybody. Alexander Cote, Exploration.
Oh, sorry, it's my eyesight over there.
No worries. Exploration and Appraisal Manager, Beetaloo and Growth Assets.
Mr. Nish. I think you might be on mute, Mr. Nish. Sorry about that. These are the technical difficulties we have in doing these things remotely.
Apologies. How's the sound?
Perfect now.
Thank you. Thank you. Simon Nish, Lead Negotiator, Indigenous Land Use Agreements, Beetaloo and Growth Assets.
Great. Thank you. Back to you, Mr. O'Grady.
Thank you, Senator. I have some opening remarks that I've provided to the Secretariat. Firstly, I acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. I pay my respects to them and their culture and to elders past, present and future. Origin's Beetaloo exploration project is a multi-year project which, if it proceeds, will deliver substantial long-term benefits to Northern Territory and Australia. It is a 9-well shale gas exploration project that started in mid-2014. To date, we've drilled 7 wells, all complying with regulations and with the consent of the pastoralists and native title holders. The Beetaloo comprises a very large gas resource with outstanding potential. This potential has been supported by recent testing at our Amungi well, but there is no guarantee that our project will progress to production. Our current focus is delivering this year's exploration work plan, all of which will inform future work, including an evaluation of the project's economics should it move to production. We've been very clear that we will consider any future natural gas developments as part of Origin's carbon commitments. Origin supports the Paris Agreement and measures to limit the world's temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. We have made public commitments around decarbonising our business. We believe in the role of gas in the fuel mix as we transition to a cleaner energy supply, not just in Australia, but globally. If successful and if development goes ahead, this project means more work for and jobs with local companies, including Aboriginal companies, the opportunity to supply goods and services to the project, financial payment for host pastoralists and native title holders, tax and royalties, providing government with more money that can go to improving community services and infrastructure, and greater energy security. We recognise and respect the connection traditional owners have to country. Our relationship and continued engagement with traditional owners is essential to how we work in the Beetaloo, both now and in the future. We would like to advise the committee that Origin has published a report about its engagement with native title holders, how exploration activity has been guided by the principles of free, prior and informed consent, and how sacred sites are protected and respected. This report was included as an attachment to our response to correspondence from the committee last year. The Northern Land Council facilitates ongoing engagement with traditional owners who are native title holders and who speak for the areas where our exploration wells are located. Sacred site clearance and avoidance surveys are undertaken at every location, which are then certified by law by the Aboriginal Areas Protection Authority, and all of our activity has been certified and complies with the Northern Territory Sacred Sites Act. This exploration project is funded by Origin. The company has not applied for nor received any funding from government under the Beetaloo Cooperative Drilling or any other program. We see enormous potential with this project, with benefits to be shared across the local community, the Northern Territory and Australia. I'm happy to take questions later.
Thank you. Next.
Thank you. Madam Chair, inquiry panel members. I would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land upon which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where our company operates, right across Australia, the 21 traditional owner groups who we work with and who support us in our operations. Honouring the Indigenous land use and cultural heritage agreements we have in place and working together to review them over the life of our operations is very important to us. Santos is a proudly Australian natural gas company with a clear decarbonisation strategy and a commitment to achieve net zero emissions by 2040 by producing cleaner energy and clean fuels. Santos is Australia's biggest domestic gas supplier. Natural gas will continue to play an important role in serving the energy needs of Australia and the world for at least the next 2 decades. This is so even in the IEA's NZE scenario, which says that about 40% of natural gas production will be used for zero emissions hydrogen production in association with carbon capture and storage by 2050. Today, converting gas into hydrogen offers the fastest, lowest cost pathway to a hydrogen economy, and combined with CCS could put Australia at the forefront of this new industry while the technology for renewable hydrogen evolves and the costs come down over time. Santos has been working in partnership with local communities around Australia for 65 years, providing jobs and business opportunities, safely and sustainably developing Australian natural resources to power Australian industries and households. We have drilled over 4,000 onshore wells across Australia, about 40 of which have been in the Territory. Santos works respectfully, side by side, with landholders and pastoralists. We have entered into more than 2,000 land access, compensation and conduct agreements with over 500 landholders across our operational areas, and we've made landholders payments of more than $700 million, delivering valuable off-farm income. Santos has 2 areas of exploration onshore in the NT, in the Amadeus Basin in the south, where we are searching for natural gas, and in the MacArthur Basin in the north, where we have identified the presence of large volumes of gas in shales. We operate within a regulatory framework that protects and recognises the interests of a wide range of stakeholders with whom we aim to consult openly and transparently. There have been 13 independent scientific inquiries into oil and gas and hydraulic fracturing in Australia. In all cases, the evidence has shown that these activities can be done safely and without harm to water or the environment, and that risks can be mitigated or reduced, and in many cases eliminated altogether with the implementation of recommendations from those inquiries. We have much to learn yet about the true potential of the shale resource in the Northern Territory, but we hope it can one day be a powerhouse of the Australian economy, at the same time retaining the Territory's unique environmental, cultural and social assets and characteristics. We're happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. I might just kick off. I know there's other senators on the line who have questions for both of you as well. But I might start with you, Mr O'Grady. I'm interested in relation to the partnership that Origin has with Falcon Oil and Gas, a partnership I understand you've had since 2014. Of course, that involves Mr Vekselberg, who is now on the Australian sanctions list as a Russian billionaire. He was a major shareholder in Falcon Oil and Gas in 2014. He still is. He was sanctioned by the US in 2018. I'm wondering why Origin, despite knowing this information prior to the latest tragedy unfolding in the Ukraine, why you bothered to keep him and this company in a partnership.
Thank you for the question, Senator. It allows me to clarify the relationship between Origin Energy and Mr Vekselberg. As you pointed out, the Origin Beetaloo project is a joint venture between Origin Energy and Falcon Oil and Gas. Origin Energy owns 77.5% of the joint venture, and Falcon owns 22.5%. Falcon is listed on the stock exchange in Toronto, and we understand from Falcon that, as you said, a major shareholder of theirs is Mr Victor Vekselberg, through his interests in, I understand, an entity known as Lamesa Holdings. And we understand that those holdings in Falcon are of the order of 16%. What that means is that, as you suggest, Senator, Mr Vekselberg has a financial interest in the Beetaloo joint venture that Origin operates of a little under 4%. I want to be very clear that the joint venture is between Origin and Falcon. It has nothing to do with Mr Vekselberg. We have no relationship at all with Mr Vekselberg. I would also like to highlight that the Beetaloo joint venture is 100% operated by Origin Energy and is 100% financed by Origin Energy. So there is an interest from Mr Vekselberg, but it is a passive interest. We were aware of the sanctions on Mr Vekselberg from the US, as you point out, back in 2018, and at that time our actions took greater control of the project to Origin, and we were happy that that distanced ourselves from Mr Vekselberg, and we were aware a few days ago that Mr Vekselberg was designated on the Australian sanction list, and we promptly contacted the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trading on advice on what actions, if any, Origin should take by this new development, and we will fully comply with any directions from DFAT and the Australian Government.
Thank you for that information, Mr O'Grady. I'm concerned that this is how these individuals get away with it. You say passive role. Granted, Mr Vekselberg is not at the table discussing, which wells will go where, which politician to meet in Australia, which one not to, who should appear at a Senate inquiry, who shouldn't. No, he's just interested in the money. And that's how men like him, billionaires like him from Russia, have got their tentacles into the rest of the world. And through the fossil fuel industry in particular. You can understand why many Australians would be alarmed that despite the strong sentiment from the Prime Minister and from political leaders across the board in Australia, we've all supported sanctions on Russia because of the atrocious actions right now in Ukraine. It gets harder and harder to execute those sanctions when men like Mr Vekselberg sit in the background, take benefit without any of the accountability. So I would like to know what the Department of Foreign Affairs has requested of you from Origin. What do you have to do to stop, if anything, Mr Vekselberg, this Russian billionaire, from benefiting from Australia's resources?
Thank you, Senator. Origin, of course, shares your views 100% on what's happening in Europe and so-called Russian oligarchs. The fact is, we're listed companies. Falcon is a listed company in Canada. Origin doesn't have any direct control over their register. If I can make another important point, I think, Senator, very clear, the Beetaloo project, which we've been developing with Falcon for the last 8 years, is a development project. So the Beetaloo project has not generated any revenue and has not returned a cent of revenue to any of the joint venture partners or shareholders through them. And I think importantly, it's not going to produce a cent of revenue for the foreseeable future, for at least a few years. So we believe we've done the right thing in contacting DFAT with all the information we have about our shareholdings. The day that Mr Vekselberg was designated on the sanction list, our legal department, dealing daily with DFAT, I must say DFAT are being very responsive and saying they understand the seriousness of the situation. I don't believe they've given us a definitive time frame on when they're able to respond, but I think they have indicated they will do it as quickly as they can. And I assure you, whatever we are advised to do by DFAT and the Australian Government, we will very happily comply with in full.
So at this point, so that I'm clear, we've got DFAT coming today, so I will ask this, I'll be putting questions to them so they can answer as well. But just to be clear, at this point, DFAT haven't told you what they would like or what you need to do as a result of Mr Vekselberg being on a sanctions list.
No, they have not, Senator.
Thank you. I understand, of course, that on the same day as Mr Vekselberg was added belatedly to the sanctions list, because he was originally off it, and he was added as an afterthought, it seems. So too was a Russian billionaire that has links to Rio Tinto and a project in relation to operations in Queensland. Rio Tinto was in Canberra on the 21st and the 25th of February for meetings with ministers and shadow ministers to negotiate around sanctions, is our understanding. That's on the public record. Were you involved in any of those meetings?
No, Senator, we were not involved in any of those meetings you referred to with Rio, and my understanding is we've had no meetings in Canberra with government ministers or officials regarding the sanction list prior to Mr Vekselberg being designated or after Mr Vekselberg being designated. The day he was designated, we immediately contacted DFAT and sent correspondence through them on that day, but we haven't had meetings before or prior.
Okay.
Or after.
So Rio Tinto was given an opportunity to negotiate, but Origin wasn't.
No, we were not at all, Senator.
Interesting. And just to be clear, you proactively, as Origin Energy or Origin, contacted DFAT, not DFAT contacting you.
My understanding is we contacted DFAT. Senator, as you're implying in your comments, we weren't surprised that he was sanctioned. We ensured that we had the right contacts at DFAT beforehand, and we contacted them straight away. I'm not sure. As you say, Senator, there's only a small number of companies where there are these financial interests from these recently designated individuals. It's very possible that DFAT reached out proactively to us on that morning as well, but my information is that we contacted them informally and then formally with all of the information that we have on the interest of Mr Vekselberg through Falcon immediately.
Thank you. So at this point, Origin isn't making any changes to your relationship or partnership with Falcon Oil and Gas?
That is correct. We think it's appropriate to wait for the advice from DFAT and the government, and we'll act promptly on that advice.
And this obviously hasn't suspended any of your operations?
No, it hasn't, Senator.
Thank you. I want to go now just briefly to the issue of government subsidies. You pointed out that Origin hasn't applied for to receive grant under the $50 million grant program. Of course, we know Santos has. I'm wondering what your position is on government subsidies for fossil fuel expansion.
Thank you, Senator. Our position on government subsidies is not that we are opposed to government assistance. For example, we've currently applied for government subsidies for some of our hydrogen activities. Hydrogen is at an early stage of development where I think it's appropriate for governments to help directly. We support government assistance in gas development. The government does a whole range of things which assist companies like us working out where we're going to put our money in terms of geological and bioregional basin assessments, support with infrastructure. And then specifically with development and appraisal, Origin has a long history of funding development and appraisal throughout Australia. That's not an activity that, to my recollection, we've ever had subsidies for. When there is government programs available, such as the Beetaloo Cooperative Grants Program, we look closely at it, we assessed it, we look at all the issues around applying for and receiving subsidies, including any obligations. We would not discount looking at future programs if they were to eventuate as well.
So you're not opposed to the taxpayer funding the expansion of the gas industry?
We're not opposed to government assistance in developing...
Which is taxpayers' money?
Correct. That is correct. And just to finish, just on the particular program, we felt that the particular program that this inquiry is particularly focused on, the $50 million fund, in our view, it was more focused at earlier stage development, and we were quite advanced.
Okay, so that's the main reason. You didn't feel like it was a fit for you?
We didn't feel like it was fit for us, Senator, that's correct.
Will you be applying for any of the support or benefit from any of the support for the pipeline, the extra $50 million pipeline feasibility study that the government's announced this week? Will you benefit from that?
The $50 million that I understand Minister Taylor announced earlier this week, that, as you say, Senator, appears to be focused on specific pipelines to move gas around the country. We're not involved directly in those pipelines, so we would not benefit directly. I understand, Senator, that some of that money is also directed towards a feasibility study on infrastructure around getting Beetaloo gas potentially to market. I think Origin could potentially directly benefit from that. And I think, again, Senator, that is where I think it's appropriate for government to have a role. We've got a large number of projects in a very remote area, and if those projects do go into production, it would be useful to coordinate paths to market in terms of pipelines, easements, what property that goes over. So I think for the government to, in the early days, spend what I expect is a relatively modest amount of money, I don't think it was noted how much it was, on a feasibility study with other governments and industry. I think that is appropriate use of government funds.
And then there's $176 million for roads in the Beetaloo Basin. That's more transport infrastructure for the gas industry, isn't it?
Look, I understand that those roads will benefit the gas industry and other users as well.
Yeah.
From our project team, I don't think those roads directly kind of go to our project. It's more general infrastructure around the region, which again is potentially a right role for governments at all levels to facilitate the development of common good infrastructure such as roads.
You keep saying, and I picked this up from Ms. Winter's opening statement as well, that your projects are all, looking to the future, the hope and a prayer that there'll be a good gas supply and we can get it out and ship it off. So this gas is all for export?
Senator, if our project goes to production, it'll be a staged development that would be very likely to supply gas locally into the territory initially. There are existing pipelines from near the basin into the eastern gas market which requires more gas, it would be very likely to also supply gas into the Eastern Australian gas market. But because of the nature of these projects, speaking for our project, if it's developed, it's likely to be developed at scale, and like the other large onshore gas projects in Australia, it's likely to have a significant amount of that gas being exported as LNG.
Yes. And if all things go well from your perspective, the money will flow, and all of this support that the government has put in goes towards helping people like Mr. Vekselberg.
It's very hypothetical, Senator. We're talking...
Oh, he's a shareholder for a reason. He's banking on getting some cash flowing through at some point, isn't he?
Definitely, Senator. I'm just highlighting that if our project proceeds to production, it'll be several years away, and it will definitely be under a different financial structure. There's also the sanction matters to consider. So I wouldn't be certain that if the project did progress to production, that Mr. Vekselberg would be a financial beneficiary to the project.
Okay, I might go to... Thank you, Mr. O'Grady. I might have some follow-up questions, but we'll go to some other witnesses. Senator McMahon, you have some questions?
Yes. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all of you for appearing here today. Just a couple of questions. One was around and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you said 40 odd wells that you have. Can you detail on any of those wells? Have you had any major contamination of air, ground or water issues?
Senator McMahon, the answer to that is no.
Thank you. And was I right there on the 40 wells?
That's correct. It's roughly 40 in the Northern Territory.
40 in the Northern Territory. Okay. All right. Thank you. So of those 40 wells, there have been no issues with environmental contamination. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Thank you. Now, if I just go to the issue raised by my colleague of the $174 million for the so-called gas roads in the Beetaloo region. Now, we heard from a witness on Tuesday who was quite adamant that those roads were only for the benefit of Empire Energy. And I did ask the question, are those roads not likely to be used by pastoralists, by community members, by transport companies, etc.? What is your opinion on who is going to use those and benefit from those roads?
Senator, I might put my colleague, Mr. Cote, on the spot because I'm not aware of any potential benefits Origin may or may not receive. Mr. Cote may or may not have some more information.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Senator, for the question. My understanding is that the upgrades to the roads are focused on some of the major arterial roads, being the Stewart and the Carpentaria. Upgrades to those roads would give direct or indirect benefit to most of the operators within the Beetaloo Basin, as well as any other user of that infrastructure within that regional area.
Thank you. So it's your understanding that those roads will be open to the use of and of benefit to all users, not just purely for Empire Energy?
Correct.
Thank you. Now, I'd just like to final question. We've had a lot of activist groups appear before us, and certainly, you know, just this week we've had groups like Get Up, Lock the Gate, the Environmental Defenders Office, the Environment Centre, Northern Territory, etc. So we've had a lot of these groups before us. Now, there have been reports in the media that I've seen that suggest that some environmental groups that are active against the oil and gas industry are funded out of Russia or funded by some of these Russian oligarchs. Have you heard any of those allegations?
Senator, I think that it's quite well known and on the public record from a number of reputable security agency sources that state actors, including Russia, have been active in influencing, social discord and so forth, and political processes in Western countries. When it comes to Russia, I think there's a lot of evidence that Russia has sought to maximise the West's reliance on products from, oil and gas from Russia, which in the case of Europe is a massive problem right now, where it relies on Russia for 40% of its gas consumption. And in fact, just last week, I think it was, the IEA released a 10-point plan on what needs to be done to reduce Russia's long-term reliance on, Europe's long-term reliance on Russian oil and gas supplies. And number 2 on that list is increasing supply from other sources. And, I think that's the really important lesson out of Russia's interference in Western democracies, is that we need to reduce, not increase, the West's reliance on Russian oil and gas supplies. In the IEA's net zero scenario by 2050, I think they have if we stop investing in oil and gas in places like Australia, the world will rely on Russia and OPEC for more than 60% of supply.
So, it could well be that in this 50 million grant program that we are actually helping the oil and gas industry to protect itself, if you like, from some of these Russian oligarchs that are potentially investing in so-called environmental groups trying to destroy Australia's ability to supply its own oil and gas. Would that be a fair statement?
Senator McMahon, I think that that the Australian government has been very aware of the risks posed to not only Australia's energy security, but the energy security of our allies for some time, and that the program was designed to accelerate the development of new natural gas sources to improve the country's and our region's energy security.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. That's all the questions I have at the moment.
Thank you. Ms Winters, I've got some further questions for you as well. You've applied under the Beetaloo drilling program for funding, Santos. I'm wondering how much have you applied for, on what basis? There's the rules around the 25%. I'm wondering what your modelling is to justify the amount of money you've applied for.
Senator Hanson-Young, Santos is not a recipient of the funding, and we won't be receiving funding under that grant program. The application was made in accordance with the rules of the program quite some time ago, and in the interim period, Santos proceeded to drill the well that we had applied for in terms of acceleration in any case, and on that basis we were no longer eligible for funding. So we've proceeded with our drilling without the funding.
So you didn't need the money anyway?
It would have. The idea of the program is to accelerate exploration, and it may well have been that we drilled additional wells had we received that funding at the time.
So the industry's doing pretty well. Origin doesn't need the grant funding to get wells drilled. Santos doesn't need it. So why are we wasting $50 million of taxpayers' money on this stuff?
Senator Hanson-Young, as I said before, I think the Australian government's intention was to accelerate the gaining of knowledge about that basin because of energy security issues, and of course, so it's not about helping the oil and gas companies. It's about a much more strategic issue, which is one of energy security in the long term for Australians and the region.
Santos and Origin, of course, you've both spoken about this in your opening statements, understand the need to reduce carbon pollution and transition. Why are we sinking this amount of taxpayers' money into an industry that will have to phase out?
Senator Hanson-Young, in 2050, even in the IEA's NZE scenario, the world will still be using natural gas, and we want that natural gas to come from countries that have strong regulatory regimes in place and that do protect the environment and try to reduce emissions as they're
How do you reduce
developing it.
emissions while creating pollution?
Senator Hanson-Young, in Santos's case, we're investing heavily in carbon capture and storage, which is a means
Which is a furphy.
No, which safely, and there are 27 operational projects around the world today storing nearly 40 million tonnes. So it is not true to say that it is an unproven technology. It is a proven technology. We've made a final investment decision on a 1.7 million tonne per annum project in South Australia's Cooper Basin, and when that's up and running in just a couple of years' time, it will be permanently storing 1.7 million tonnes of CO2 every year.
Well, if it's going to work so well, you shouldn't have to use taxpayers' money to do it, should you?
All of these emerging technologies, the governments around the world are trying to accelerate the deployment of these technologies. If we didn't have government support for low emissions technologies, I think US Secretary Granholm said yesterday at the IEA that only 6 of the 46 low emissions technologies that are needed to be deployed by 2050 are commercial today. Without governments accelerating the deployment of those technologies, they won't be economic. Energy prices would be higher for consumers. That's a big factor. In the last 2 years...
Just going to have to interrupt you, Ms Winters, because I have to just let my colleagues know down the line that we've got media in the room who wish to film, so just making sure that there is no objections to that. Just speak. I'll take that as no objections unless anyone wants to raise concerns. No? Okay, go ahead. Thank you. I'm going to go to some questions from other colleagues. As Senator Thorpe.
Thank you, Chair. My first question is quite simple. Why didn't you want to come to this inquiry when first called? to the point that the committee had to force you to attend. Did you not want to come to face traditional owners who told us, without question, that they do not consent to fracking on country?
Thank you, Senator. Firstly, I'd like to make it clear that all of our activities in the Beetaloo have consent from the native title holders, as will any future activities. But regarding your specific question, Origin saw the main focus of this Senate inquiry being the cooperative funding grant, and given that we were not a party to that funding, we chose initially to submit to the inquiry and appear at the inquiry through the peak industry body, APIA. Given the inquiries, as you say, quite an insistence that we do appear, we are happy always to stand up to scrutiny on our activities, and I'm glad that we are now here in front of you responding to your questions.
So am I. Thank you for that. But I just wanted to go back to something you said, and that was that you have the consent of the traditional owners. Now, I'm not sure whether you were asleep when we had the inquiry this week, but we had a room full of traditional owners who said that they did not consent. What do you say to that?
Thank you, Senator. I'll respond to that, and I'll throw to my colleague, Mr Nish, for some more detail. But to be very clear, as per my previous remarks, we have consent from the native title holders. We know that there will be differing views amongst community about issues like development and gas and fracking, and we always offer to meet with any interested...
Yeah, I understand what you're saying here, but you're saying that you are, because you have consent from a bureaucratic process that manufactures consent and lets you talk to a corporation or a land council, who you also heard this week, that don't represent the people. And you can say that there's differing views, but we had a room full of senior traditional owners from the Beetaloo say that they have no consent. Now, I think I heard you acknowledge country earlier, past and elders, past and present. Did you say that?
Correct, Senator.
Well, how can you say that and then decide who you're talking to when it comes to traditional owners? How can you acknowledge country when you're actually disrespecting country? Please answer that.
If I may, Senator, I'll ask my colleague, Mr Nish, just to expand a bit further on our engagement with native title holders and other traditional owners.
Before you do that, I asked you a question. You acknowledged country, you acknowledged the traditional owners, and then you tell me that the people in that, I want to know, do the traditional owners that appeared in front of the Senate inquiry this week, do you respect and acknowledge them as traditional owners, or just some?
Absolutely, we respect and acknowledge those traditional owners, Senator, and some of those have attended...
What does that mean?
Some of those have attended our annual general meetings, and we have offered to meet with those traditional owners, and we will meet with any traditional owners who have an interest in the areas where we explore.
So do you respect that there are quite a number of traditional owners of the Beetaloo that do not give you consent?
We respect that there are a range of views.
Yes or no? It's a simple yes or no question.
Just, Senator Thorpe, just let the witness answer the question. Mr Grady,
Sure.
answer the question.
Thank you, Senator. If I may, Senator, I'm not dodging the question, but I've spoken a bit on this matter where Mr Nish is more the expert with Origin. So if I may, can I ask Mr Nish to respond to some of your comments and questions?
Mr Nish.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks for the question, Senator. Is my sound coming through okay?
Yes, it's fine.
Thank you. What sits behind the question of consent, in our view, is the Native Title Act, the agreement with native title holders, but also how people understand free, prior, and informed consent. We have exploration. We have consent for exploration. That's consent under the Native Title Act and consent in a contractual agreement with native title holders, represented by the Northern Land Council. We don't have consent for production, and we haven't yet sought consent for production. That's yet to come, depending on exploration success. So we haven't even started consultation around a production scenario because we don't yet know if we're going into production. So we have no information around, you know, what it would be, where it would be, scale, location, so forth. Free, prior, and informed consent. It's a universal principle reflected in the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, but there's no universal definition. So you have to land on something into something operational. So we work to the IFC Performance Standard 7 definition of International Finance Corporation Performance Standard 7 definition of free, prior, and informed consent. We see the value of that in that it's transparent, it's public, it's a definition of free, prior, and informed consent that is used by many international agencies and institutions. It's been adopted by the Equator Principles.
Yes, thank you. I don't, because we, sorry,
If I might, if I might continue.
Senator Thorpe, you have the call.
I'm just, in the interest of time, I understand what free, prior, and informed consent means to me as a First Nations woman. Tell me what that looks like in practice for you, Mr Nish. In practice, very simple terms.
Like in practice is having regard to the traditional decision-making processes of the native title holders in the Beetaloo Basin, and those traditional decision-making processes are in part set out in the native title determinations, where people who hold native title make decisions according to whether they're in primary state groups or secondary state groups. Secondary state groups and primary state groups hold native title together, but primary state groups have primacy. But I do want to make the point, one important thing about free, prior, and informed consent is it doesn't amount to unanimity. So there may be dissenting voices, but provided that the traditional decision-making process has been applied, it's that traditional decision-making process that informs consent. There may well be dissenting voices. That doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't consent under the rules of free, prior, and informed consent.
Thank you, Mr Nish. So basically, it's up to the courts to decide the traditional decision-making process at the end of the day through the native title framework. You've got to go to court to do that. And there are a number of traditional owners who do not provide consent for you to do what you do. And I just ask you again, in terms of your acknowledgement to country, to traditional owners, what do you say to those room full of traditional owners from the Beetaloo who travelled all of that way to say no to fracking the NT? What is your message to them, Mr Nish?
We understand that the federal court determinations of native title recognise Aboriginal customary law. So the determinations are a reflection of Aboriginal customary law. So what we say to them is we respect the native title determinations, we respect the decision-making reflected in those native title determinations, and we respect the views of traditional owners to have a range of views, but ultimately we will respect the traditional decision-making process of those groups as reflected in their determinations of native title.
Thank you, Mr Nish.
Senator Thorpe, just so that you know, I think Ms Winters here wanted to jump in, if you're happy to throw a
Sure.
question. Ms Winters?
Not in particular, but I would add that that Santos respects the decisions of the federal court in relation to who the traditional owners are for various parts of Australia. And while we consult with all traditional owner groups who want to do so, we do respect the decision of the court. And we do have agreements in place with 21 traditional owner groups across Australia, including for our operations in the Beetaloo.
Okay. Thank you. Senator Thorpe, final question, then we'll have to go to Senator McCarthy.
Sure. Oh, well, while we've got you, Ms Winters, you previously employed Mr Sean Drapps, is that right?
Sean Drapps was a contractor for Santos some years ago, yes.
Do you know what he did after he finished working with you?
Yes, I do, and as far as I'm aware, it's perfectly lawful for people to apply for advertised positions, go through interview processes and merit-based appointments, and my understanding is that that is what Mr Drapps did.
Does he still hold shares with Santos?
I would be unaware of whether he ever held shares with Santos or whether he still does, Senator Thorpe.
Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator McCarthy?
Yes, thank you, Chair, and good morning to the witnesses present there this morning. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you fine.
Okay, thank you. Mr Nish, can I just go to you, just following up on some responses you gave to Senator Thorpe there firstly, if I may. You said that you do not have consent for production. You have consent for exploration. Can you just walk us through where you're at with your exploration in terms of trying to seek consent for production?
Thanks, Senator. We've started preparatory discussions with on how we would go about negotiating and doing and how the process would occur around seeking consent for a production agreement. The Amungi results last year were definitely encouraging and sufficiently encouraging for us to start those discussions with the NLC. The challenge is having sufficient certainty around whether we're going into production, and if so, what the detail of that looks like. So there's actually a grounded title holders who actually understand risks and benefits to inform their decision about whether to consent or not. We're not quite there yet, so we're certainly in the preparatory phase of discussions with the NLC around how we might approach a negotiation process to reach a production agreement.
Can you just explain to the committee, Mr Nish, what is that process? When you say you're in the preparatory stage, what are your timeframes around trying to seek consent?
At this stage, I think it's on the public record that I'm not sure it's in. We would hope to make a decision around production by, I expect, the middle of this decade, and so we would want to have a production agreement with no title holders by the middle of this decade. So we see that there is still plenty of time to go through a quite detailed consultation engagement process with no title holders around what a production scenario might look like, and so people can properly weigh up the risks and benefits.
So when you make reference to Amungi and the positive outcome for Origin that you say came from last year's tests, what is the span of production that Origin is looking at in terms of the years ahead?
I might defer to my colleague Alex Copeland on that.
Yeah, sure. Mr. Coe.
Sorry, just thank you for the question, Senator. And just to confirm, just so I answer it correctly, are you wondering what type of additional sort of appraisal and production data is required to make informed decisions about a development?
That's correct. I mean, Mr. Nish has said that Amungi, came up with some positive results for Origin at the end of last year, which has obviously moved you on to this next phase. I'd just like to understand what is your estimate of a time life for that Amungi area?
Okay. No, thank you very much for the question. Yeah, so the Amungi result was definitely a positive result and definitely provides us with line of sight to commercial outcomes. As Tim would have said, it's still very early days and there's still a lot of de-risking that needs to be done. Over the next 2 to 3 years here, essentially what we'd be looking to do in an area that we deem prospective enough to be commercial is to drill sufficient wells over that time period to gain the confidence that that area both has sufficient commercial resource within that area and wells have line of sight to commerciality. To do that effectively, we're looking at a 2 to 3 year period.
A 2 to 3 year period through that process or beyond that process?
So Origin's approach to any sort of unconventional development will always be in a sort of a staged process. So if we just take a look at the next stages, the next stage here is in the to ensure that the result from Amungi is not false positive and that we can get repeatable results within a given area. The step following that would be something that we'd call piloting or delineation, where within an area that's large enough to support your first tranche of development, so a small scale development that would feed into domestic markets, that still requires several large financial commitments. So we'll want to have sufficient well data to underpin those decisions.
So Mr. Coate, does that mean, because we are trying to understand the issue of consent here, does that mean when you say that your process is a staged process moving forward, does that mean seeking consent from traditional owners is a staged process as well, or do you go back to them with the request for sort of a blank check, so to speak, an open book for consent to keep going through all your staged processes? How do you do that?
Maybe I'll provide a little bit of context before handing back to Simon. So Simon and I work very closely together because obviously the work that I do is a very important input to what Simon does. And as Simon has alluded to, things that are extremely important to him is one, what areas are we focused on, and then what a development would look like. So the work that myself and my team are engaged with is to provide those types of inputs to Simon. And we need to understand Simon's process is a process that takes time to do it in a meaningful and constructive way. So when I provide inputs to Simon, I usually give inputs that sort of encompass a range of scenarios that we feel we'd be likely to be taking forward through the next stages of our project. But if it's okay, I'll hand back to Simon to elaborate further.
Sure. Mr. Nish?
Thanks, Senator. It's a really good question because I think I understand you're trying to grapple with, look, it's a stage development, so where's the consent in it and how informed is the consent? That's
correct.
Yeah. We will go to the no title holders with a specific proposal because otherwise it's not an informed consent. So we will go to no title holders with a specific proposal. We will flag what further development may occur beyond that, and we may have to build in stage gates of further consultation and engagement and consent to accommodate that. So it won't be a blank slate from domestic to large-scale export. It will be, we'll go to you with a proposal. It'll have a kind of, window around it. If we go around that, beyond that window, then we're going to have an agreed mechanism with native title holders around what information they have for that additional phase and what the kind of informed consent process is for that.
Okay, and just in terms of the number of native title holders that you have to work with, have you got a number that you can provide to the committee?
You mean number of people?
That's correct.
Well,
By all means, if you haven't got it with you, Mr. Nish, but we do need to understand just who who companies are talking to.
There's two parts to that. So all of the estate groups who are holding native title will be engaged with. We expect that they will be asked to nominate a steering committee, and it will be the steering that sits at the negotiation table with regular processes of information flow from their constituents to the steering committee and back. So we do. This hasn't been agreed by native title holders, but I think that's the question we'll put to them. Will they be comfortable with the kind of representative structure that puts forward those who'll be negotiating? But of course, they've got to, as you rightly pointed out, there's got to be mechanisms to keep the information flow back to the broader native title holding groups.
Would you be able to provide us with those steering?
So could you repeat the question, please?
Well, you mentioned steering committees. Would you be able to provide us with the details of those steering committees, please?
They haven't been formed yet, so we're still in the planning stage of planning the discussions with LC around their planning of the consultation that will yield a steering committee.
All right, we'll keep in touch with you on that, Mr. Nish, because we clearly need to understand how this process is being taken by Origin. Can I just go to you, Ms. Winters, in terms of your process with TOs and specifically similar to the questions I've asked of Origin?
Senator McCarthy, I think, as I said, we respect the legal process. We engage through the Northern Land Council in the case of the Beetaloo and essentially follow the required processes. As I said, we engage with any traditional owners who want to engage with us, but when it comes to the right to speak for country, we work through the Northern Land Council and we respect the decision of the Federal Court.
Can I just go to the area of the Darley Waters region, and can I just ask what kind of investment goes into some of these roadhouses and the Darley Waters pub area from your companies, and I leave that open to both of you.
Senator McCarthy, I'd have to take that on notice. I'm not aware of any investment in those things, but I can certainly take that on notice and investigate.
And
Thanks, Ms. Winters.
I can ask Mr. Kate to respond if he has any of that information, Alex.
Thanks, Mr. Cato.
Yes. Thank you for the question, Senator. Just trying to get my video working there. I'll answer it in part, and then to provide specifics, I'll be able to provide more specifics on notice. But we always look at opportunities to work with any of the businesses, especially businesses that are as local as the ones in Daly Waters. We do use their services, from accommodation to working with locals around the use of lay-down yards and other aspects that can support our business. And that goes beyond just the business owners within Daly Waters directly, but with companies like Triple P to provide services to our well sites. We are very actively engaged at always looking to expand the business opportunities to local companies within the Daly Water and Barkly region.
Okay, are you able to provide to the committee the businesses that you do work with there? You mentioned Triple P, and I'm certainly aware of Triple P, and I know that they are an Aboriginal company.
So,
Would you be able to provide further? Sorry?
Thank you for the question, Senator. Yes, if I can take that on notice, I can provide you with a fulsome list of local companies that we do business with.
Yes,
Thank-
that would be good. Thank you.
Just to clarify, Senator McCarthy, for Ms Winters, you've agreed to take on notice Senator McCarthy's questions as well, and with that, we would like a fulsome list of businesses that you are engaged with in relation to the scope of the question. And would you like the notional financial amounts, Senator McCarthy?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Ms Winter, when Santos merged with Oil Search in August last year, your company's statement to the ASX described your holdings in the Beetaloo as supporting the Gladstone and Darwin LNG terminal backfill or expansion. That suggests to me that the primary purpose of your operations in the Beetaloo Basin is for export. Is that correct?
The primary purpose is to support both the domestic market and the LNG market. Santos, our CEO, Kevin Gallagher, is on the record supporting domestic gas reservation. And so our intention is to support both markets. The reality is that the scale of investment required in the Beetaloo, just like the scale of investment that was required in the Surat Basin and that was required on the Northwest Shelf, can't be supported by the domestic market in Australia alone because the domestic market is too small. The other thing I would
To make your cash, you have to export this.
It's not about making cash. As I said before, I'm very proud of the fact that we support energy security in this country and across the region. And I go back to the IEA's comments only last week with number 2 on their 10-point plan for reducing Europe's reliance on Russian gas, being to increase gas supply from other sources. So I think Australia is a very important LNG supplier to the region for security reasons, and at the same time it allows us to develop gas for the domestic market as well, which wouldn't be able to be developed by relying on the domestic market alone.
You've got interests in both the Darwin and the Gladstone export terminals, don't you?
Yes, we do.
And how much is that worth?
I'd have to take that on notice. I don't have that number off the top of my
If you
head.
could take that on notice, that would be helpful. What will happen to the value of these export terminals if Beetaloo isn't developed? I think that they're not reliant on the Beetaloo is the answer necessarily. Why was that the primary reference in your statement to the ASX then?
It's not about those projects relying on the Beetaloo. It's about where Beetaloo gas would go. So it's not that the projects themselves are reliant on Beetaloo gas, but those are options for how that gas would be processed and used.
Do you have enough gas supplies to meet your export contracts,
Yes, we do.
and right up until 2035?
Senator Hanson-Young, I would need to come back to you with details on that. But most of our gas is contracted, yes, on long-term contracts.
So you've got enough gas currently to support your export contracts till 2035.
No, I said that I would come back to you. I'm taking that question on notice. So, but we do have long-term contracts with, a long horizon of production.
So at this point, you have enough gas to fulfil your export contracts.
Yes.
So you don't need the Beetaloo Basin.
It's not about our need for the Beetaloo
Well, you're not
Basin.
doing this out of the goodness of your heart. You're a corporation.
Senator Hanson-Young, we develop gas to meet customer demand. We don't develop gas if customers don't want it. So we're meeting
Export customers.
and domestic customers and export customers.
What is the
and
percentage?
Can I make a
Sorry,
point on
could
price?
I ask a question, Ms Winters? What's the percentage of gas that you sell in Australia domestically versus the gas that you export?
I couldn't answer that off the top of my head, but it is well known that LNG exports are much larger than the domestic market, and that is because of the size of the markets in Asia and the relative small size of the market in Australia.
So most of the gas that you sell goes overseas?
That's correct. Supporting energy security in Japan and East Asia.
Are you worried about the carbon emissions from gas that you export overseas?
We have a target to work with our customers to reduce their emissions by 1 million tonnes a year by 2030, and we are working with them to do that. But in addition to that, Santos is responsible for Scope 1 and 2 emissions, which are our own emissions, and we're very focused on achieving net zero by 2040 when it comes to those emissions. The accounting framework for emissions is that customer emissions are actually the Scope 1 and 2 emissions of other companies. So we will work with them to help them reduce them through carbon capture and storage and by other means. And as I said, we have a target by 2030 to help them reduce emissions by about 1 million tonnes a year.
But as long as it's shipped offshore, you don't have to worry about the pollution.
It's not. That's not. That's
Well, it's
not
not
correct.
part of your counting, is it?
Yes, it is. We report our customer emissions every year in our climate change report.
But in terms of your goals of reducing the pollution that Santos is responsible for, you don't have to account for what you ship overseas, do you?
Senator Hanson-Young, just to go back, we do have a target by 2030 to work with our customers to help them reduce their emissions by 1 million tonnes or more per year.
But you keep expanding.
As I said before, we expand
You
to
understand
meet...
the logic of this. We have to reduce pollution. But what we have here is a proposal for both Santos, for Origin, for other fossil fuel companies to expand, to make the situation worse, to make climate change worse. I mean, a primary school student could understand that you can't lose weight if you keep eating a pack of donuts a day.
Senator Hanson-Young, Santos produces gas not because because we simply want to produce gas. We produce gas because customers want natural gas and need it. And, in the last 2 years, energy poverty globally has gone backwards. There are 3 goals here: decarbonisation, energy affordability, universal access to energy, and reliability of supply. And in the last few years, because of the focus on limiting supply, we've seen record high gas prices around the world, which are hurting the poorest global communities. So we're focused on 3 things: decarbonisation, affordability for customers here in Australia and in Asia, and reliability of supply to achieve that UN Human Development Goal of universal access to energy, as well as decarbonisation.
A lot of spin goes into having to justify all of this, doesn't it, Ms Winters? I mean, it must be exhausting.
I believe it's Senator Hanson-Young, and I'm very proud of what we do.
Can I ask you, hang on, I've got a specific question in relation to the relationship between Santos and Tamboran. That's another company that has now been given $7.5 million of taxpayers' money in the Beetaloo Basin. You're in a partnership with them, Santos, is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Mm-hmm. And so that is for a separate well with them? Or how does that relationship work? You've just told me you're not interested in taking money from this grant. This company has it, so can you just explain that, please?
Senator Hanson-Young, I don't know what Tamboran has applied for. I can only speak for Santos.
Did you speak to Tamboran before coming here today?
No.
What's the relation? Can you describe for us here so that we can understand the nature of the partnership between Santos and the US company Tamboran?
Senator Hanson-Young, I will take that on notice because I don't have the details of the joint venture arrangements on hand. So I will take that on notice and come back to you with the various joint ventures that we might be engaged in with Tamboran.
We heard as a committee directly from pastoral company Rallin, who've provided to this committee documentation that they received, including threatening legal letters sent by Tamboran to them. Are you aware of those legal threats?
No, Senator Hanson-Young, I'm not. I have no knowledge of correspondence between Tamboran and Rallin.
Do you know if Santos, anybody else at Santos, has any knowledge of these?
I would have to take that on notice, Senator Hanson-Young.
Did you get any briefing from your team in relation to Tamboran before you came here today?
No.
Did you think that perhaps you'd need to know something about the relationship before you appeared today?
Senator Hanson-Young, my understanding was that Tamboran was asked to appear, and I assumed that Tamboran would speak for itself.
I would like you to take on record whether you are aware of these legal letters that have been sent, which has been considered a legal threat by the pastoralist Rallin. I would like to know whether Santos is aware that those letters were sent, had any involvement in drafting those letters, whether there was any authorisation from the Santos perspective on the cease and desist letters from the solicitors. I'd like a full response in relation to that to be taken on notice, please.
I'm happy to do that, Senator Hanson-Young, but I would doubt very much that Santos was involved in any way in Tamboran's correspondence.
To that point, I think it should be pointed out, and I should just declare this as chair, that Tamboran was asked to come to this hearing today. In fact, they've been asked to engage with this inquiry for some time now. They continue to refuse. They've just been given a grant of money from the federal government, so they are now accountable to the Australian taxpayer, and they are refusing to comply and participate. As a committee, we will consider what we do with this information, but seeing as you are here, Ms Winters, I just put it on record that it's not a good look for that company, and I suggest in relation to your association, Santos's partnership, we'd want to be very clear as to how that is unfolding, given this is a US company. They take Australian taxpayers' money and they don't think they have to appear at a parliamentary inquiry. It's pretty poor form. Senator Thorpe, do you have any remaining questions?
I'll put my questions on notice.
Okay,
Thanks.
all right. Thank you, Mr O'Grady and your team for appearing today. We appreciate your appearance, and particularly in person. Same with you, Ms Winters. You've both taken a number of questions on notice. It is, from memory, the 4th of April that they are due. Yes, the 4th of April. So I appreciate that there's a bit of work to be done, but we're trying to get this inquiry finished, of course, before the looming election. So thank you very much. Thank you. I now welcome representatives from the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. I remind senators that the Senate has resolved that an officer of a department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given a reasonable opportunity to refer questions asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies and factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. For the Hansard record, could you please all state your full names and the capacities in which you appear today?
Thank you, Senator. Andrew Walter, First Assistant Secretary, Regulatory Legal Division, Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Thank you, Mr Walter.
Good morning, Senator. Ben Plale, Assistant Secretary of the Australian Sanctions Office and Transnational Crime Branch in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Thank you.
Good morning, Senator. Michael Growder, Assistant Secretary of the Trade Expansion and Diversification Branch within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade.
Great, thank you. Mr Walter, does DFAT have a opening statement you'd like to give, or are you happy to go straight to questions?
Happy to go straight to questions, thank you.
Okay. Could we start, of course, with the questions in relation to the 41 individuals with close links to President Putin who were sanctioned on the 7th of March. Did Ministers Payne, Pitt or Taylor have any involvement or communication with your department in the decision about who was on that list?
So what might be helpful is if I just set out, I won't go into this in too much detail, how we've gone about developing the various tranches of sanctions, and we've had some announced today as well. So what we do is we work with like-minded countries, mainly the ones you'd expect, the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, and more recently New Zealand, with our other colleagues across government and within the department to identify targets in relation to sanctions. We then prepare detailed information for the Minister about those targets. and then we provide them by way of submission to the Minister, and then the Minister, I think in all cases in this instance, approves those targets, and then we go through the process of doing the formal listing through the Office of Parliamentary Counsel. So the short answer is yes, but I think it might be just helpful to say that that's how we're doing it. We are developing the targets with our partners across government and with...
Just to clarify, when you say targets, are you meaning individuals?
So the individuals and entities who will be subject to sanctions.
Yes, targets of the sanctions.
Targets of the sanctions,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes, okay. And so obviously it makes sense to have Minister Payne involved in those conversations. What I'm interested in is whether Minister Pitt or Minister Taylor were involved in any of those conversations.
So the decision maker in relation to the Autonomous Sanctions Act, listings made under the Autonomous Sanctions Act, which is legislation in play here, is the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Now we obviously, and you know, it'll depend on which tranche of sanctions we're talking about. We obviously reach out to our departmental colleagues where we need information that would be relevant to those sanctions. In terms of consultations the Minister might have had with her colleagues, I think that would have to be a question for her.
Is that a question you could refer to the Minister for us, please?
We'll see what information we can find.
Thank you.
Obtain,
Was there any communication between DFAT and the departments of Minister Pitt and Taylor?
Is there a specific set of... Sorry, was this in relation to that set that you mentioned in terms of...
Yes.
Because there's a lot of tranches of sanctions here. I
Yes.
think we're up to 14, tranche 14 today. I don't know whether you know, Mr Player, but we might have to take that on notice and check what consultation in relation to that one. It feels like a very long time ago at this point for both of us.
What perhaps I could add, Senator, is that there are regular interdepartmental emergency task force meetings that are chaired by DFAT about all issues to do with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We give, as the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, updates on sanctions actions both taken and planned at those meetings. Those meetings are attended by a broad sweep of Australian government agencies, so that is one tool that we have used to inform other agencies.
Why was Mr Vekselberg omitted from the list on the 7th of March?
I don't think that's a correct characterisation. So in terms of what we've been doing, the way we kind of conceptualise it, for want of a better term, is we are doing a rolling set of sanctions. As I've mentioned, we are in close contact with our partners overseas as to who they're sanctioning, and also working across government in terms of identifying those targets. The way this has worked as a process is we work up those targets, and when we are in a position to advise the Minister about them, we provide that information to the Minister. And some of those take longer than others. We have obviously a process we have to go through, and there's information that we need to have on hand to be able to provide to those who are going to have to enforce the sanctions. For example, the Australian Border Force. We go through that process and we've been providing that information to the Minister kind of when it's ready, more or less on a daily basis as we've been going along. The only other kind of nuance on that is we have been trying to, I guess, group them in common themes where that's practical, although that hasn't always been practical.
Okay,
So you see we've done sort of oligarchs and banks together, for example, as different groupings.
Yes, okay. So just for the record, when was Mr Vekselberg put on the sanctions list?
So we provided our submission to the Minister on the 16th of March. Mm-hmm. She approved that submission, so approved the listing of those two individuals on the 17th of March. We lodged the instrument with the Office of Parliamentary Counsel late that day, came into effect at 12:01 a.m. on the 18th of March. And
that list that you gave to the Minister, which then came into effect on the 18th, you're saying? Correct, yes.
There
were two individuals.
That's correct.
Mr. Vekselberg and
Mr. Deripaska.
yes, and they've been grouped together because they're both oligarchs that have fossil fuel interests?
No, not specifically. So we had been working. So
I'm just wondering, you
no,
talked
no, I
about the
understand.
reason they weren't on the original list was because they didn't fit into that categorisation. I'm trying to work out what category these guys fit into.
so this isn't.
Guys is a bit too friendly. These men.
This isn't a perfect characterisation, but we've kind of, our initial approach was to look at, for example, political figures like the Duma and other decision makers. We looked at some of the core banks very early on as well.
Yeah.
And then we changed our focus towards some of those more economic players, and we've worked through a series of approaches to oligarchs. So we've got, essentially 2 submissions around oligarchs. It's more about when is the information ready, when are we in a position where we can say to the Minister, if you're minded to do so, you can make a decision on these people. And of course, there are people who we've considered who we didn't put forward for various reasons, because we ultimately decided they didn't meet the criteria under the Autonomous Sanction Act or regulations.
In relation to the individual linked to Rio Tinto and the operations in Queensland, it's on public record that Rio Tinto were here in Canberra negotiating in relation to this in February. Who were they negotiating with? Who were they talking to?
So we were present at the evidence given earlier. We're not aware of any discussions that Rio Tinto had with ministers, and no outcomes of those discussions were communicated to the department, if they occurred. I have no information about whether they occurred or not.
Could you take that on notice, Mr. Walter, in case there is anybody within your department who is aware?
If the minister.
And if the minister is aware, thank you. Obviously, in relation to Mr. Vekselberg, who's been the subject of questions to Origin this morning, that individual has been on a US sanctions list since 2018. Has that not been a concern for Australia up until now? And from a DFAT perspective, do you monitor these things?
Well, I think there's 2 questions in there. So if I take the latter question first, of course we keep ourselves apprised of what's occurring, particularly for our like-minded countries. The United Kingdom tends to be a better comparator for us because their sanctions regime is more similar to the one that we have. The United States often takes action in relation to matters that, and I'm not commenting on these particular individuals, but they might take action in a broader range of circumstances than we might think is in our national interest. But of course, we monitor what our partners are doing. And yes, we're aware that these 2 individuals were sanctioned. I can add that the United States amended its sanctions in relation to those 2 individuals. Again, their scheme has some quite significant differences to the way ours works, and so they've taken a slightly different approach there. So perhaps, as I said, the better comparator is with the United Kingdom, and we're pretty in lockstep with when they sanctioned and when we sanctioned.
Can you be confident that you have complete oversight of each and every asset owned in Australia by these listed billionaires from Russia?
I think complete confidence, I don't think I have complete confidence in anything. However, what we do, which might be useful, we obviously... So to step back just slightly, it's obviously an offence to breach an Australian sanction law. So we work very closely with our enforcement partners. So, for example, the Australian Border Force, with the Australian Federal Police, with AUSTRAC. and they go through the process of trying to identify these assets. Of course, and it's already been raised, there can be very complex business structures which make those things difficult. That's a concern for all of us, and I think it might be helpful just for this committee's knowledge. Australia is participating in a G7 working group. So it's convened by the G7. It was initially a ministerial discussion. There's working groups that sit below that to actually undertake this exercise to help us all identify assets wherever they may be and
So a kind of
freeze them.
sharing of information.
Sharing of information, enforcement activity.
And is that a relatively new thing?
I can't remember. It was about the ministerial discussion occurred a week and a half ago, I'd say. There was a public statement about that. We'll provide that on notice so the committee has it. And there have been discussions at the departmental level, and there's another discussion, I think, scheduled in the next week or so.
And is there any specific categorisation within that group of information flow for those who have interests in fossil fuel?
It's not particularly focused on that. It is focused on elites and oligarchs, though. That's where it's targeted, that particular group.
And this difficulty that you've identified of having to peel back the layers of these various different company structures and shareholdings is very, I mean, it's a minefield, isn't it?
Of course, yes.
In 2016, the government promised a register of beneficial ownership of companies. Much like the Anti-Corruption Commission, it seems to have just dropped off. No one seems to know what's happened to it, and perhaps you could help us if you know. But it hasn't advanced at all over the last 6 years. Surely that type of register would be helpful at a time like this.
That particular proposal falls within the Treasurer's responsibilities, and I think it'd be a question better directed to the Department of the Treasury.
Sure, but for you right now, having to try and work out whose interests are in what companies and how much do they own, what interests and benefits they have in Australia, a register like that would be helpful, wouldn't it?
At the risk of giving a slightly irritating answer, I think it's going to depend on the design of the register and how that interacts with what we're trying to do. Obviously, we work with Treasury as well and with other departments to identify what the information that we need, and of course our law enforcement agencies do that as appropriate.
And you're not aware as to why that register hasn't eventuated?
I can't comment.
And you haven't been given any explanation from Treasury throughout these conversations that you've been having about where is the register, why hasn't it happened?
It certainly hasn't come up in any discussions I've had. I'll look down the table, but it looks like it hasn't in any discussions my colleagues have had either.
Another announcement not followed through, I suspect. I'm interested as to what happens now with these companies in Australia, Rio Tinto and Origin, who have these individuals who are now on the sanctions list. What actions, let's take Origin, seeing as it's subject to the Beetaloo Basin, what actions do Origin Energy have to take now in relation to this individual? What impact does that have? Can we unpack that a little bit? Because it's both the opaque nature of the structure, the financial structure is one thing, but we can't just put people on a list and say job done. It must have some impact, surely.
Completely agree with that. Do you want to take them, Mr. Platt?
Sure. Thank you, Senator. Perhaps as an opening comment, it's worth noting, of course, that it is the responsibility of Australian businesses to comply with Australian sanctions laws, not the responsibility of DFAT to comply with them on the business's behalf. So this onus rests in this case with Origin in the instance of the Beetaloo Basin project. I heard Mr O'Grady earlier say that Origin had been in touch with DFAT very promptly upon Mr Vekselberg's listing. That's correct. We heard from Origin on the 18th of March, the same day that the listing took effect. We have mechanisms for any Australian, not just businesses, to approach us using an online portal and to seek a formal indicative assessment from the Australian Sanctions Office as to whether a particular activity falls foul of Australian sanctions laws or not. That is precisely what Origin has done. We have an indicative assessment on our online portal from Origin. Origin's provided a lot of information accompanying that request, and we're working our way through that now. It's a priority matter for us. I hope we can conclude it very quickly. It's a little difficult to give an exact timeline because of some of the complexities of corporate structures that we've been touching upon in this discussion.
You can imagine that people listening to this would be a bit frustrated that this Russian oligarch has been listed. He's on the sanctions list. Origin say, well, he's not in the driver's seat of the project. No, he's kind of in the back end. He's going to get all the benefit of if this project gets off the ground. Right? If sanctions are to be a disincentive and to be a punishment, then we do need to have there does need to be a clear communication, surely, from the government as to what should be expected.
Senator, perhaps if I approach it this way. So the obligation in relation to financial sanctions, which is what we're talking about here, is not to provide a direct or indirect asset, to provide assets directly or indirectly to the sanctioned individual. So if for example, providing a profit payment to an individual who is sanctioned would clearly breach Australia's sanction laws. I think where the complexity comes in is through that indirect benefit question and how many structures might be in place, and that's exactly what we're working through. But I think it's very clear if you were to provide any form of direct benefit, with line of sight that is going to a sanctioned person, then you are in breach of Australia's sanction laws.
So trying to unpick what this actually, the effect of this actually means is these individuals have shareholdings in companies that are in partnership with Australian companies who have bids in for projects here in Australia. Every time the government sends a message that we're going to open up fracking in the Beetaloo Basin, that increases the share price of these companies that have invested. Therefore, these Russian billionaires continue to count the change. So, and unless you actually cut through that, every time the Prime Minister stands up and says, oh, we need a gas-led recovery, here's $50 million to accelerate the gas industry, he's helping these Russian billionaires.
I don't think that's correct. I think that
But you can't say it isn't, because you haven't cut off the shareholdings.
Well, there's a few different limbs to that, and I think it gets difficult to be talking in hypotheticals. And the challenge, and we've been discussing this before we came up here, the real challenge here is individual situations are going to vary depending on what the corporate structures are, the nature of the investment vehicles, who the individuals are involved, what the particular sanctions we've applied to those particular individuals. So we have to work. So it's very, I guess what I'm saying is it's very difficult to say in a hypothetical example like that, whether that's true or not, and we'd have to work through examples. So,
but his benefit, but just to be clear, Mr Vekselberg's benefit here is his share price.
I don't know about his company structure, so I can't tell you whether that's
But
true
he's
or
the
not.
major shareholder. And his company is in partnership.
So again, I prefer not to go down that path because we're in that process of working with, a business about what those structures are. So I understand the point you're trying to make. We have ways in which we try and address that.
But we don't have a plan yet for making sure that Mr. Vekselberg or the other Russian oligarch in relation to Rio Tinto does not benefit from decisions made here in Australia.
So we have imposed those sanctions. Australian companies are required to comply with those sanctions. They're expected to do their own due diligence. They have the option to reach out to us, which has occurred in the case of Origin, as we've heard, and we are talking to them about that. The plan has been, we've imposed the sanctions. Australian companies need to comply with them.
Yeah.
We have an enforcement approach to those sanctions. Of course, a part of any good regulation is where companies are trying to comply and are willingly trying to comply, we assist them to the extent that we can.
In relation to, if Origin's project looks now more positive to the market because of announcements the government's made, because of the global concern around energy security, looking for gas to be imported and exported from places elsewhere than Russia. If that leads to a tick up in the share price of a Russian oligarch's company, is that a breach of the sanction?
I mean, perhaps, Senator, the question in terms of looking at our laws and what our laws prohibit, the question would be, with those set of facts that you've outlined, has Origin directly or indirectly provided any kind of asset to Vekselberg? Now, some of the factors you've outlined aren't specific to Origin. It might be difficult to say that Origin in particular had provided any sort of asset through to
But
Vekselberg.
being in partnership with Origin is enough, isn't it? Otherwise, why are these companies invested? They're partners.
It depends, as Mr.
You
Walter...
don't have to be in the driver's seat.
As Mr. Walter has said, I mean, I think the best answer to that, and I echo his comment that it may be a slightly frustrating one, is it comes down to the technicalities of these corporate arrangements and whether, in fact, in this case we're talking about, Origin is directly or indirectly providing any kind of asset to Vekselberg through that chain of
So
companies
how do we
where the
work out
interest
if
lies.
there's an indirect? Is it indirect that his share price goes up?
I think, again, there's a couple of challenges here, again, with your example. Again, to reiterate the point that we now both made, it's going to be, you're going to have to trace through the links. The catch is also, how would we ever know the causal link? There could be a correlation, but the share prices go up and down for all sorts of reasons, and how would you ever directly form a direct causal link between the share price going up on a stock exchange in a foreign country in relation to an announcement made in Australia? The third point, and Mr. Playles touched on this, is some of the factors you identified. For example, a government announcement in Australia made by a minister is not, in this case, Origin Energy, taking action that directly or indirectly benefits that individual. So, some of those factors are, would be completely out of Origin's control. So they're just complex factual scenarios that we'd have to work through. I understand the point you're getting at, and just to throw in another just broader policy point, after the last reforms that were made to the Autonomous Sanctions Act, the Magnitsky-themed reforms, the government undertook to do a review of the Autonomous Sanctions Act, and we are in the early stages of conducting that review. And these questions about how the scheme works are exactly the type of questions we'll need to be thinking about in the review context.
I'm going to go to, thank you, and I appreciate the complexity. I guess that's the point.
We feel your pain.
I just find it extraordinary that these Russian billionaires who have been making millions and billions of dollars of fossil fuels around the world can continue to make money off Australia's expansion. I just think it is appalling.
So just 2 points. The first is it is very evident that what we have done to date and what we will continue to do is having a very significant effect in Australia, and the fact that you've got Origin and others talking about the very fact that, you know, they're looking at their arrangements and how they're structured and what they will, and, you know, have given commitments to comply with Australian law as you'd expect, and looking at their arrangement to see that they are complying is a clear sign that the sanctions are having an effect. And the second point is just to reiterate that direct or indirect benefit falls foul of the Act. Now, sometimes it's going to be tricky to identify indirect benefits. However, you know, in the instance, I think, of the companies we've been talking about, there is goodwill to avoid those kind of benefits, and they are looking to avoid those kind of benefits being provided.
Thank you. I've got a couple of other senators who have questions. Senator McMahon, are you there?
Hello, yes, I am. Sorry, I was just on mute.
That's okay. So you're, yes, there you are.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Senator.
So, yes, thank you. And thank you to everyone appearing here today. I have a question that I posed earlier in the day to Santos and Origin that I'd also like to pose to the department. There have been allegations and media reports that Russian oligarchs, Russian companies, etc., are actually funding some of the activist groups that are campaigning against the oil and gas industry. And now we've heard in our inquiry, we've heard from several activist groups, including Get Up, Lock the Gate, Beyond Zero Emissions, the Environment Centre Northern Territory. Are you aware of any of the allegations that Russian players could be actually funding environmental activist groups?
Thank you, Senator. We're aware of reports. However, I think your question's better directed to the Department of Home Affairs, which has a particular role in countering foreign interference. And certainly these kinds of suggestions of foreign powers funding groups across the political spectrum in other countries have been pretty prominent, but I think that question's better directed to the Department of Home Affairs, who leads on this issue.
Yeah, look, that's fine, but you are aware that there are reports of this occurring, is that correct?
I'm aware of the media reports, but I can't add anything to them.
Yep, no, that's fine. That's all I had. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator McCarthy.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to follow up on just a couple of things, if I may. Mr. Plough, can I just check with you, just in terms of the sanctions process? I was online to try and understand a bit more around DFAT and the sanctions process, but I need to just understand how it works. Should there be a breach, and who actually does that? You mentioned the Australian Border Force, but for people on the ground here in the Northern Territory, for example, is there any expectations on them to also do something should they be aware of any breach?
Thank you, Senator. Look, if somebody on the ground became aware of a breach of any law, I'd suggest that they report that to the police, and Australian sanctions laws are no different to any other criminal laws in that respect. Needless to say, being the Australian Sanctions Office, there's no obligation for people to give us information of possible sanctions breaches, but we are all ears if they chose to share that information as well.
And what are the, you say it is an offence, what is the offence in terms of penalties?
In terms of penalties for individuals, the maximum penalty is 10 years in prison. In terms of bodies corporate, there are very large fines. I'm sorry, I can't remember the maximum fine right now, but we are talking in the millions.
Okay, please take that on notice. I'm just following up some of these questions. Now, you spoke about the fact that the relationship with the UK and its sanctions are better comparatively than the US. Can I ask, when did the UK make the decision in terms of Mr Vekselberg?
Certainly, Senator. The UK, if I recall correctly, announced that it would impose sanctions on Mr Vekselberg on the 15th of March. And then, as Mr Walter outlined, Minister Payne made a decision that Australia would impose sanctions on Mr Vekselberg on the 17th of March, and they took effect on the 18th. So this is in actual fact a good example of how coordinated we very often are with the United Kingdom.
Okay, so that's just a simple process that occurred because the UK did it.
No, I wouldn't say that. We come to our own decisions on these matters, as you would anticipate. And as Mr Walter has outlined, there is a lot of, and indeed the Minister has outlined in public comments, there is a lot of due diligence that we need to undertake before recommending a sanction listing. But we are, as background to the recommendations that we put to the Minister, consulting very closely with our like-minded partners, most notably the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada and now New Zealand. Now they have established a sanctions regime for these purposes. So those discussions with international partners inform the recommendations that we put to the Minister based on our own due diligence.
So what was the due diligence that you did between the 15th of March to the 17th that made you realise Australia should put them on the list?
I wouldn't say that the due diligence we conducted was necessarily specifically in that period. In the last exactly a month, in actual fact, the first sanctions we imposed in relation to Russia's invasion of Ukraine took effect on the 25th of February. In that month, we have listed 488 individuals and 33 entities, and as Mr Walter outlined, we've considered a whole bunch besides that didn't make the cut for various reasons as we undertook the due diligence process. So it's not as though we woke up on the 15th and turned to these two. It's been an ongoing process of literally looking at hundreds of targets at a time over the course of the last month.
And where on the DFAT website would we find all those individuals and 33 entities listed?
Senator, we maintain a consolidated list of all persons and entities who are listed for all sanctions regimes. Obviously, that's a very important part of our role as a regulator. We need to inform the Australian public of whom it is that we've actually sanctioned and whom it is they need to be aware of in possible dealings they're undertaking. You'll find that list at dfat.gov.au/sanctions, and in the menu bar on the left there is a link for the consolidated list. You'll appreciate there are thousands of names on that list, but it's readily searchable by regime, by country, by nationality, by all sorts of different ways.
And I might just...
Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, Senator, can I just add that as we've been updating that list, we have a we have an email subscriber list which has about 5,000 subscribers on it, mainly industry and banks and so forth. As we've been updating that list, we've also been emailing subscribers so that they've got almost a real-time alert that the list has been updated.
Okay.
And what sort of program?
Yes.
What sort of program does DFAT have to educate and inform First Nations people in Australia about that list, especially given we've got a large number of rangers who cover the coastline and need to be aware of these issues? Are there any, is there an education unit within DFAT to do that, or a language translation? We have over 100 Aboriginal languages here.
Thank you, Senator. Look, it's certainly a key role for the Australian Sanctions Office to do outreach to the Australian community to explain Australian sanctions laws. Your question about specific programs for First Nations peoples is a good one. We don't have anything that is specifically oriented towards Indigenous Australians, but we certainly welcome...
Why is that? Why is that when, I mean, we're talking about Beetaloo here and people trying to understand what's going on with the sanctions, but we also have, as I said, ranger groups who do patrol the borders and need to understand these laws. I'm just wondering why DFAT hasn't got that.
Senator, we're always available to speak to any Australian group about Australian sanctions laws. We'd be very happy to speak to those ranger groups in the Northern Territory.
The other thing I might just add, Senator, as well, is where it's the sanctions we impose are going to be most relevant for rangers is around import and export controls. In this particular instance, most of those imports and exports are in relation to import and export controls we've imposed to be in relation to large commodities which are unlikely to be finding their way across borders in any easy way. We're talking about oil, gas, alumina, those types of products. And of course, Australian Border Force has a critical role to play there. But it is a very good question, and we'll put some thought into it. Thank you.
Yes, well, given that most of the minerals, certainly here in the Northern Territory, nearly 50% of the landmass is Aboriginal land, and there is no education unit within DFAT, I would encourage you urgently to look into that, because it goes to the heart of trying to understand one another. And English language translation, you work with all these countries overseas and their languages, yet we have our very own languages here that are just being completely ignored.
And can I just say, Senator, the answers we've been giving have been related to sanctions specifically. Of course, the department does a range of activities and outreach with Indigenous Australia. They're an important part of our foreign policy landscape in terms of their interests, as well as their contribution to Australia more broadly. So there is a lot of engagement with Indigenous Australia by the department more broadly. Our answers were focused on sanctions.
Yes, but I do come back to the fact that you've got traditional owners here in the Northern Territory who are being consulted around Beetaloo, and if they don't understand the sanctions in relation to this one particular billionaire, if DFAT hasn't reached out to them, then that is a huge gap that's missing in your process.
We understand the point, yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Walter, before we finish with you, I just, reflecting on the evidence given by Origin and the evidence we've heard from you today, I think it's still very unclear what these sanctions actually mean. And Origin has said they're not going to change anything. They're going to keep going the way they're going. Hasn't put a halt to their project. The government keeps announcing more and more money for Beetaloo Basin. As recently as this week, another $50 million, which of course enriches Vexelberg's shareholdings. Where are the breaches and where are the consequences of being on a sanctions list?
I think I can only repeat what I said earlier, which is to say, on one level, sanctions law is very, very clear. You must not provide an asset to somebody who is the subject of financial sanctions, and you must not deal in their assets. So, more obvious in a financial setting where we freeze any bank accounts, for example, of somebody who has been sanctioned, and they cannot be dealt with. The law is very clear on that, and it's both direct and indirect benefit. The question you're asking is really around is it a breach of Australian sanctions law effectively merely to have a holding in Australia in relation to a company? That's, the question we need to work through is that mere fact resulting in anyone providing an asset to a sanctioned person? And what we've assiduously tried to avoid doing here is giving you a direct answer in relation to any of these projects, because that's something that we're working through with those companies.
Okay. And you've taken some questions on notice. We don't have a time frame for when you'll have clarity over what this means for Origin, or indeed Rio Tinto, or the Russian billionaires at the centre of it. Surely time is of the essence.
Of course, it's a significant priority for us. But to give you some sense, so you're aware of it, we've received well over 100 inquiries in relation to the operation of the new sanctions laws. Obviously, there's a range of them. There are a range of questions that we are working through as well. Some of them are very important to individual Australians who have contacts with Russia, so we're working through those as well. It's not the only thing we're working on, but of course this is a priority for us.
You've said that it's hard to work out what is an asset. Is an exploration permit jointly held, in this case by Origin and by Falcon? Is that an asset?
Senator, an exploration permit is certainly an asset. An asset is defined in the Autonomous Sanctions Act for these purposes incredibly broadly. So it is an asset or property of any kind, whether movable or immovable, tangible or intangible. And an exploration permit would certainly, like most things, fit within that definition.
And if they were to be given a permanent licence, that'd be a significant asset.
The Act doesn't distinguish between significant or otherwise, but it would be an asset, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So at least we know what the asset is. The issue is going to be whether you do something about it, whether Origin does something about it. Thank you for your time, gentlemen. We're just going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back with the Department of Industry, Science, Energy, Resources, Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, and the CSIRO. Thank you for making time today.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, broadcast. I now welcome representatives from the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, Department of Agriculture, Water and Environment, and the GISER, Department or Unit of CSIRO. Is that correct? Thank you. I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, could you please state your full names, the capacities in which you appear today? Maybe we'll start from this way and go there.
Thank you, Chair. Daniel Quinn, I'm the General Manager of the Resource Strategy Branch in the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources.
Thank you.
Michelle Croker, I'm the Head of Division of the Onshore Resources Division.
Dr. David Robinson, I'm the Branch Head for the Basin Systems Branch at Geoscience Australia.
Thank you. And Ms. Rowley, are you on the video conference?
Yes, Senator. So Kath Rowley, Acting Head of the Climate Change Division in the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources.
We might just ask for representatives from the Environment Department to come to the table. Perhaps if we could just move Ms. Rowley's name down here and you can come and sit up here.
Thank you, Senator. James Tregurtha, Acting Deputy Secretary, Major Environment Reforms.
Great, thank you. Appreciate you all being here today, and particularly given, realise this is a busy week given only a couple of days out from budget. So we do appreciate your time. Now, does anybody have a brief statement they will... Yes, I'm getting a nod here. From
Yes. Yes, thank you, Senator. So on behalf of the Department of Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, I begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting from and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I also extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today or attending online. I thank the committee for the opportunity to attend today's hearing. The department previously appeared in August last year, represented by my predecessor, Mr. Paul Trotman, and other department colleagues. At that time, judicial review proceedings restricted the department's ability to answer questions without first seeking legal advice. We took a number of questions on notice, and the department has subsequently provided the committee with answers to those. I note that the proceedings that were underway when we last appeared have since concluded, and in appearing today, we will do our best to answer the committee's questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? No? Okay. I might kick off. Well, actually, I might go firstly to Senator McCarthy, if you're available.
No worries, Chair. Thank you very much. Thank you to all who've appeared this morning there. We've obviously had the hearing up here, and there's just some things I'd like to follow up with, if I may, from evidence that some of our witnesses gave earlier this week. And I think I'll go to the Department of Agriculture, Water and the Environment. So maybe you, Mr. Tregurtha?
That's right.
I'd like to just understand how the federal department works with the Northern Territory Department of Environment in terms of the 135 recommendations of the Pepper Inquiry. Are you able to provide to the committee what interaction you have around those recommendations, and specifically the ones that do relate at a federal level?
Thank you for the question, Senator. So we of course work closely with our colleagues in the Northern Territory Environment Department in relation to any matters that might be raised that are relevant to the department in relation to its responsibilities, both under the EPBC Act, but more broadly as well. In relation to the inquiry you're talking about, I imagine from my recollection, the commentary in the inquiry mainly that was of most relevance to our portfolio was in relation to the implications of the findings of that report for the operation of the water trigger, which is a component of the EPBC Act in the Commonwealth. At this stage, the government has no plans to extend the water trigger to cover unconventional or shale gas.
Senator McCarthy?
Yes. Can you hear me? Sorry.
No, we couldn't.
Me?
So start again.
Yep. Could you just tell the committee how the government has come to that conclusion? What decision-making process was there?
I might ask, perhaps I'll start, Senator, and then I might ask my colleague, Mr. O'Connor-Cox, if he's got any further information to provide. So in terms of that, in terms of the, I guess, if you like, amendments to the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, the government has released, following the Samuel review of the entirety of the EPBC Act, The government has released its Pathway for Reform, as you'd be aware. That reflects a number of potential changes based on Professor Samuel's recommendations. In addition, you'd also be aware, of course, that the government has its current legislation before the Senate. One component of that legislation, that proposed legislative change, I should say, the bills, is in relation to following up on a recommendation in Professor Samuel's inquiry. As I understand it, I think the inquiry you're referring to was an inquiry for the Northern Territory government and the responsibility of the Northern Territory government to respond to, rather than the Commonwealth. So at this stage, certainly, I guess our focus as a department has been on the Commonwealth's review of the EPBC Act and the recommendations made by Professor Samuel.
I'm just trying to understand. I mean, you said in your statement,
Sure.
just at the outset, in response to my first question, is that the government had made a decision not to move forward on it at this stage. So I was just trying to understand how you had made that decision.
Yeah. So, sorry, Senator. My colleague, Mr. O'Connor-Cox, probably potentially has some more information.
Senator Declan O'Connor-Cox, Assistant Secretary, Environment Protection Reform Branch. Just to reinforce what Mr. Tregurtha's evidence was, the government has not made a decision to expand the scope of the water trigger. The independent review of the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, conducted by Professor Samuel, was released earlier last year, and the government has released a pathway document and an associated timeline which together spell out the priorities for the government in its staged approach to reform of the EPBC Act. And the government's first priority is to implement single-touch environmental approvals underpinned by standards and assurance.
Okay, so are you saying to the committee that the Samuel review is the reason why you won't look at the question around the water trigger recommendation of the Pepper review?
No, Senator, that's not what we're saying. I think the clearest way of putting this, and I'm happy to follow up with more information if needed, but the clearest way of putting it is that my understanding is the inquiry you're referring to, I think it's the Pepper inquiry, is that correct? It was an inquiry commissioned by and reporting to the Northern Territory government, not the Commonwealth government. So the recommendations made in that report were provided to the Northern Territory government. I am conscious that a number of those recommendations go to matters that are beyond the jurisdictional remit of the Northern Territory government. But in that case, I guess, from our perspective, I guess the missing step, if you like, is that I would have to go back and check whether the Commonwealth government has had any representations directly as a result of that report in relation to making the change you're suggesting. I'm happy to take that on notice and go back and determine whether any direct representations have come in to which the Commonwealth would have responded. But at this point in time, we consider that report was a report commissioned by and reporting to the Northern Territory government.
Mr. Tregurtha, it was totally commissioned by the Northern Territory government, but this particular recommendation requires the Commonwealth to respond. And in our questioning of the Northern Territory Agency, they had ticked the box in their recommendations that the water trigger recommendation had been completed. And when I asked them, the witnesses this on Monday, just in relation to what did that mean, in their response, and please by all means go and have a look at the Hansard, it meant that they had done what they needed to do, which was to alert the Commonwealth. So if you can please have a look at what correspondence you've had with the Northern Territory government in relation to that, and also provide to this committee what your response has been to that particular recommendation.
Absolutely, Senator. I'm very happy to go back and do that. We'll try and get that done as quickly as we can.
Okay. All right. Chair, that was the specific question I wanted to go to. I'm happy to refer back to you at this point.
Thank you. I've got questions coming from Senator McMahon.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you for appearing. Could I just have one question. Now, we've heard today and previously that there are a lot of wells that have been drilled in the Northern Territory. Can I just ask any of you appearing in this session, is there any instance where any of this activity has caused environmental contamination of land, air or water?
Not to my knowledge, but I will refer over to Dr.
Yeah,
Robinson.
I'm happy to take that question, Senator. The wells are drilled all around the country for a variety of purposes, including, for example, the extraction of water. Would it be fair to say you're asking about wells drilled for hydraulic stimulation for oil and gas?
Yeah. Yes, sorry, okay. Thanks for clarifying that. Yes, I am.
No problem at all. Look, I'm not aware of any examples of damage from hydraulic stimulation anywhere in Australia in the 60 years that the petroleum sector has used hydraulic stimulation.
Thank you. Was anyone else wanting to answer that question?
Senator, I might add that to date we have received no referrals under the EPBC Act for actions involving unconventional gas in the Beetaloo Basin, and neither have we had pre-referral meetings with any potential proponents.
Senator,
okay, thank you.
Senator McMahon, just following up on that, will you be expecting a referral and application if projects go ahead?
I would expect that where there is a likelihood of a significant impact, that proponents will conduct a self-referral, as a self-assessment rather, as is the requirement. And if there is a likely significant impact that they will refer, that is the requirement under the legislation.
And while we're on this topic of referrals and approvals under the EPBC legislation, we know from reports from and announcements from the government over the last couple of weeks that the Morrison government wants to create regional plans, and we've had a little bit of discussion about this over back and forth in this committee. Have you been directed to look at the Beetaloo Basin as one of those regional areas?
Senator, there are a number of considerations when considering which locations are suitable for a regional planning approach. Professor Samuel, in his independent review, recommended that we try and move away from a project-by-project approach and move to a more landscape scale approach, and that has a number of advantages from an environmental perspective.
There's a number of advantages from a corporate perspective too.
And those decisions have not been made about the locations for where those regional plans will be developed. That's something that will be considered in consultation with state and territory governments.
So the Prime Minister announced several $1 million a week or so ago to accelerate this regional plan process, but you're saying to me that government doesn't even know where they're going to be.
There's been no final decision about where those regional plans will be.
I'm sorry, Senator, I might just jump in there as well. Mr O'Connor-Cox is right. So we haven't yet, the government hasn't yet made any final decisions about a location. However, clearly we have been thinking about what a relevant location for potential regional plans would be, which goes to, of course, areas that are both where there is prospectivity for development, regardless of whether that's mining development or agricultural development or commercial or residential development. So where there are areas of prospective development, and where we know there are nationally protected matters, which, as you'd be well aware, is pretty much anywhere these days. That if you look at those areas where there are protected matters, we're very conscious that there are threatened species in the Beetaloo Basin area, and that there is prospectivity for development there. So that is one potential of many areas that we would look at in giving advice to government. But at this point in time, as Mr O'Connor-Cox said, the government's made no firm decisions about where those plans will be.
Mm-hmm. But the Beetaloo Basin is on the list of options.
Oh, sorry. I'll just I wouldn't characterise it as a list of options. I'd say there are a range of areas that we're looking at.
Which includes the Beetaloo Basin.
Which includes the Beetaloo Basin. It includes Cape York. It includes southeast Queensland. It includes a range of different areas.
The Pilbara.
That have a range of different, quite possibly, I don't have the full list in front of me at the moment, but of course there's many areas of Australia where we're conscious there are threatened species, and there's development prospectivity where regional plans could well play quite a constructive role in terms of taking forward a conversation around appropriate development in those areas.
So the Prime Minister makes this announcement, hundreds of millions of dollars is put on the table, but no decision's actually made. It seems this is a constant pattern of behaviour.
Well,
Big cash splash, announcement, press release, press conference, and no detail.
Senator, the government has committed to up to 10 regional plans. It's provided the department with not hundreds of millions, it's provided the department with 60 odd million. I don't have the precise figure.
I believe 62.3 million.
62.3 million.
Years, and that commences from 1
over
July.
4 years. Now, clearly it will take some time to both land on appropriate locations for those plans and then undertake the work to put them in place, including with state and territory colleagues.
But there are 10 places. You know what those 10 places are.
No, that's incorrect, Senator. What I said was the department is working with states and territories to consider a range of possible potential areas that might be appropriate for a regional plan in order to continue to provide advice to government as they move towards final potential locations for those areas.
Where does the number 10 come from then?
Well, that's a government commitment, Senator, to up to 10 regional plans.
So not based on anything, just that it looked like a nice round number.
Well, as I said, it's the decision of government, Senator, is to commit to up to 10 regional plans. The department will continue to work with government to advise them on potential
Will any of those
locations.
regions be announced before the end of the month?
Well, that's a matter for government, Senator.
Are any of those areas close to being decided?
Well, again, the department continues to provide advice to government. I can't go to the...
Okay. Dr Robinson, I feel like you wanted to jump in there. Do you need to clarify something? Are you going to tell us what these 10 places are?
No, I wasn't going to tell you what the 10 places were. I'm sorry, Senator. As that's already been mentioned, it's a matter for the government. But I was going to mention that the federal government has invested significantly in understanding already the potential for impacts for oil and gas development in the Beetaloo Basin. And I'm referring specifically to the geological and bioregional assessments program. So I'm happy to provide some more information on that if it's useful, but that program was designed to assess the impacts of shale and tight gas development on a number of basins in the country, and the Beetaloo was one of those. The findings of that program are now out and available, and I'm happy to talk to those if that's of interest to the committee today.
I think we've got a lot of other questions. Well, just hold that. I'm going to go to Senator Sheldon.
Thank you very much, Chair. Just want to get an update on how important this project is for domestic and international energy security in the near future. If someone could answer that for me.
Yes, thank you, Senator Sheldon. So, as you, in regards to your question, yes, we are seeking the government is seeking to mitigate the risk in Australia of what is happening overseas at the moment in Europe with very high gas prices and issues with security of supply, and doing that through measures that are underneath the gas-fired recovery agenda, which is aimed to support economic growth, productivity, job creation by providing reliable and competitively priced gas domestically, but also supporting our export industry. And a key part of that is to unlock gas supply, again to support both our domestic market use and also our export markets. It's to deliver an efficient pipeline and transportation market, and also to ensure that gas customers can access gas at competitive prices. And a key element of the work that we're doing to unlock supply is the strategic basin plan work. That includes the Beetaloo Basin plan that has been released and the associated work with that. Also, the National Gas Infrastructure Plan process, which the government has been undertaking to identify priority actions and establish a long-term development pathway for the East Coast domestic gas market out to 2021, and looking at measures to accelerate priority project investment to ensure that domestic market security alongside our benefits that come with our export industry as well.
And just on that near-term question, in light of what's happening with conflict between Russia invasion of Ukraine, what's the immediacy of this project and how that plays a role in those concerns?
So I think what is happening at the moment, obviously, with Europe and the situation with Ukraine, is that it's just a real demonstrating the volatility of the gas market and how important it is to be able to have investment in new supply and also storage to manage impacts in the market, including seasonal demand as well. And the IEA actually noted that earlier this year in January and has said that the current market situation is a stark reminder for gas-consuming countries of the importance of implementing their security supply toolboxes, including policies to protect consumers and optimise the use of gas infrastructure. So that includes investing in new supply and investing in infrastructure like storage.
I think I just want to go to a slightly different matter. Just regarding the project, what measures has been taken by government and industry to ensure manufacturers have access to gas at affordable prices?
So to ensure that manufacturers have access to gas at affordable prices. So there's a range of measures really underneath the gas-fired recovery agenda. So in addition to unlocking supply to ensure that there is adequate gas supply in the domestic market, the government's also negotiated a 2-year heads of agreement, which was signed by the Prime Minister and the East Coast LNG exporters to offer uncontracted gas at competitive prices to the domestic market first before it's exported overseas. The government's also signed agreements with multiple states and territories to progress reforms to ease restrictions on gas exploration. It has also funded the work that's being undertaken by CSIRO and to support research undertaken on the Gas Industry Social and Environmental Research Alliance. And we are also continuing that work to ensure that we have an efficient pipeline and transportation market so that customers are able to access that gas in a way that is economically efficient as well. And I'll also note that there has been an industry code of conduct has been agreed between producers and and major gas consumers as well on conducting purchase of gas domestically as well.
Good, thanks very much. So I'll go back to you, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. We heard from Santos earlier this morning that the Beetaloo Basin would not be viable, opening up the Beetaloo Basin would not be viable without international exports. Do you agree with that?
I don't think that I have an opinion on that, but certainly the objective of the Beetaloo Basin program is to look at accelerating the exploration and evaluation of the basin potential, which is really important to understand actually the prospectivity of that basin, which would then, of course, have the flow-on effects to both the domestic gas market and the export market as well.
A company that's spending its own money, not part of the grant program facilitated by the government, has said to us today that unless they export this gas, it's not worth it. So it's for export, isn't it?
Thank you, Chair. Look, I don't want to speak to Santos's views in particular, but I would confirm that this is the issue of scale of the industry has been raised by a number of participants previously, not just in the Beetaloo, but in other parts of the country.
Yeah.
In terms of whether the gas is for export, certainly our conversations with various groups is that it's likely to go to 3 different places. Some of it will go to export, some will go to the Northern Territory, and the Australian government is committed to getting some of it to the East Coast gas market because that is a key driver of the activity that we are undertaking in the basin.
Mm-hmm. If no new gas fields are built, opened up, what will be the total production here in Australia by 2030? So by the end of the decade. You must have modelling on this type of stuff.
Senator, I'd be very happy to take that on notice and come back to you with those.
I'd like to know what the figures would be, for 2030 and 2035.
So sorry, so you confirmed 20 and 2035, and specifically you were after
what the total production will be in Australia if no new gas fields, i.e. the Beetaloo Basin, are not opened up.
Certainly we'll come back to you on that one.
And I'm assuming you have this type of modelling, right? Like this is the whole purpose of the government's proposal to put money on the table. There must be modelling behind it.
We should be able to come back to you with those figures, yes.
Great, thank you. How much work has the department done on reducing gas demand for the National Gas Infrastructure Plan?
So, Senator, reducing gas demand. So the National Gas Infrastructure Plan, as I just mentioned earlier, is about providing a blueprint looking at supply and demand and what is going to be needed over the longer term in terms of gas infrastructure, to be able to ensure that we've got an efficient and effectively operating market. So as part of developing that National Gas Infrastructure Plan, we took both looking at both those supply and demand forecasts, and they underpin the findings that are in our National Gas Infrastructure Plan.
So what have you done to reduce the need for gas in Australia?
So the National Gas Infrastructure Plan is simply a blueprint document outlining potential market trends and need to ensure that we have what level of infrastructure we need to be able to meet the demand.
What about infrastructure to reduce demand for gas?
So sorry, Senator, I'm not quite sure what you're referring to, infrastructure to reduce demand.
Well,
Are you
if
talking about
we
new-
invest in other forms of energy and the infrastructure to facilitate being able to disperse other forms of energy, then surely that reduces demand on gas, doesn't it? And
So-
pollution?
So, Senator, so the National Gas Infrastructure Plan does just look at national gas infrastructure. So, and I think perhaps that's why you're asking what other forms of infrastructure does it look at. So it only looks at national gas infrastructure, but there is a range of other projects, of course, being undertaken within the
So the
Department
whole
of
plan is just about more.
It's about a blueprint at looking at infrastructure requirements for a national gas.
Okay. What is the current domestic demand for gas in Australia?
Sorry, I'll just see if I can come back to you during this session on that. I don't have that figure right in front of me on the domestic demand, but I know that in terms of the level of, in terms of the production of gas that we have in Australia, about 30% of that is for domestic production as opposed to the rest, which is exported.
So 30% of the gas produced in Australia is used domestically, 70% goes overseas.
Yes, about that amount, yep.
So if there was ever a suggestion of a shortage of gas in Australia, that would be false because there's plenty of gas in Australia, it's just most of it's shipped offshore.
It's whether it be available to be sold onto the domestic market or not.
I asked before about what the total production figures would be for 2030 and 2035. I would also like to know what the domestic demand will be for those years as well, and I imagine you've got that in your modelling.
Yep, we'll be able to provide that.
Thank you. The Victorian State Government's planning to reduce their gas consumption by 25 to 50% by 2030. What would this mean for our major terminals and gas pipelines that are being, proposed to be built out of the Territory and into the East Coast? You talked about 3 categories of where gas will go. What happens if Victoria reduces their demand for gas?
Well, if there is a reduction in demand for gas, then that will flow through to what type of infrastructure will be required out for the domestic market. And there are the types of issues that we'll be considering in our next National Gas Infrastructure Plan, which will be due to come out later this year.
When is that, later this year? When is that due, just so that we can keep an eye on that?
There is no particular time frame, but the government are committed to a further National Gas Infrastructure Plan, but it'll be a decision for government when it actually releases that.
AEMO, of course, monitors these things very carefully, and the strong electrification scenario outlined by that agency sees domestic gas consumption fall by more than half by 2040. You'd be aware of this report. What's going to happen to the infrastructure that's built under the NGIP, the National Gas Infrastructure Plan, if domestic demand by 2040 is halved?
So what I will say about the National Gas Infrastructure Plan is that it's a point in time, and of course, the market is changing, and that is one of the reasons why that it's useful to put out a further plan which will take into account any changes in the market conditions. And again, we look at demand and we look at supply trends. We draw on information that is prepared by AEMO in producing the NGIP. So the NGIP will take into account what's happening in the market and again comment on what type of infrastructure is required to support an effective and efficiently operating market.
How much are the gas terminals in Darwin and Gladstone reliant on opening up new gas fields such as the Beetaloo Basin?
I'm not in a position to comment on that. So I'm not...
I can't be definitive, Senator, but perhaps I would note that there are a number of both onshore and offshore developments currently being looked at around Darwin. Similarly, I would say that the terminals in Gladstone operate almost purely off the Surat Basin in Queensland. So I hope that helps.
Those terminals are only viable if we continue to export more and more gas, surely.
Well, obviously there's economies of scale, yes, when the terminals are running at full capacity. I'd have to take on notice whether there is any sort of operation below that full capacity at either terminal, but I'm happy to come back to you on that, Senator.
Are you aware as to whether they're running at full capacity at the moment?
Well, no, as I just said, I'm not aware of that, but I can take that on notice and get back to you, Senator.
Has the government got any financial interest in these gas terminals and these export terminals growing?
Well, obviously the LNG industry is a key export for Australia. It's grown quite a lot in value over the past 12 months as we've seen the energy shortage affect global markets. Those exports are not only, those companies not only deliver taxation and royalty revenue to different levels of government, but there's also the effect on Australia's whole terms of trade. As we saw in the last resources boom, the Australian dollar ended up above the US dollar at one point, and that transfers wealth to all Australians. And I think
What is the tax revenue from these gas exports?
Sorry, Senator, I'd have to take that on notice as well.
Is that something that you have access to?
Because the taxation system in Australia involves taxes and royalties at the state level, and I'm guessing you'd like both of these,
Yes,
Senator, and the federal level, it is a little bit of a complex question, but we can certainly come back to you on that.
You know, the Australian Tax Office has called these gas companies systemic non-payers of tax. I don't think they pay much tax at all, do they?
It's really a question for Treasury, Senator, but I am happy to follow up on that for you.
Could you also take on notice how many of the companies that are using these export terminals are Australian owned versus foreign or companies or foreign state owned companies?
Sure.
What's your understanding as to who owns the export terminal in Gladstone?
There's 3 export terminals in Gladstone.
And who owns them?
APLNG and the GLNG and sorry, it's just skipped off the QCLNG terminals.
Yes.
So are you going into specifically kind of who are the shareholders?
Yes, I'm interested as to how much. What's the Australian interest in this?
So I'd have to take on notice kind of the company structures that are behind that. I'm sorry, I don't have that detail with me here today.
Is there a fair bit of foreign state financial interest in those? You must understand that. Surely you'll watch these things very closely.
I'm sorry, I don't have that information here, but happy to take that on notice.
Could I also have you take that on notice for the Darwin terminals as well, please?
Certainly.
China, Malaysia and Korea all have state-owned enterprises that have ownership stakes in these export terminals. You must be aware of that. Australia has none. So you can take it on notice, but maybe the reason you don't know is because Australia has none. So the argument as to what we get out of this as Australians, these companies don't pay tax. The ATO has criticised them for it. And it's other foreign companies and state governments who are benefiting. Do you disagree with that?
I just don't think it's our place to comment on that.
You're the Federal Department for Industry, Science, Energy and Resources, the Australian Commonwealth Department.
So, Senator, I mean, we have spoken about, the benefits of the industry and the export industry to the nation as a whole, and that is part of, the objectives under the gas-fired recovery measures. Again, is to support economic growth, productivity and job creation by providing reliable and competitively priced gas domestically, but also supporting our export industry as well.
The Beetaloo Basin will funnel billions of dollars to state-owned companies of China, Malaysia, Korea, foreign companies. They don't pay tax in Australia. It's going to make our climate worse, not better. And it's doing nothing to help energy prices at home. It's a sham, a total sham. And hundreds of millions of dollars, taxpayers' money, is already being spent by the Morrison government. And you sit here and say it's not our place. You are the Federal Department. You give expert advice. I'm going to go to Senator McCarthy.
Thank you, Chair. My questions I've put on notice for the department. I have quite a lot of questions, but I would like them in written form. Thank you.
Okay. Senator McMahon, have you got any other questions?
No, Chair, nothing from me, thank you.
Okay. All right. I think we will leave it there. There's lots of questions on notice coming. You've got till the 4th of April and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you. Well, that will conclude today's proceedings. I'd like to thank all the witnesses who have given evidence to the committee today. I thank Hansard Broadcasting, the Secretariat, thank you, and all of those who appeared in person. Thank you very much.